Hi everyone, my name is Alex Hyatt. I'm one of the TAs for this course. To some of you, my voice will sound familiar. As a part of Marian's Contemporary Art in Aotearoa, New Zealand lecture, I'll be adding on here discussing a certain Polynesian spatio-temporal concept, VA, and how contemporary New Zealander artists are using and manifesting this concept to create, innovate, and critique colonial histories in a way that is engaging and educational for the public, and which is connecting and healing for Indigenous communities who are creating these works and who are represented in them. I'll define VA for you all. I'll go over some important terms that will come up for you, and then briefly discuss how some of these contemporary artists are manifesting VA in their works and sort of how they're doing that. And I wanted to note that I'm only going over a few examples here. So as you begin to think about this notion more broadly, and especially for this week, really start to think about it as an analytical framework, which I think will be very fruitful for you, again, particularly for this week's material. My hope is for you to see how this notion is used specifically to generate the continuation of Polynesian cultural vitality, autonomy, and reclamation. So first things first, what is VA? Like some terms we've discussed and talked about in this class already, the definition is not hard and fast. It is quite fluid and largely conceptual and reliant upon context. Va or wa is a term used in many Polynesian cultures. It has a Proto-Polynesian root of wa. The meaning across cultures is usually having overall very similar meanings with slightly varying definitions, as you can see here. So the top definition we have is va. It's defined as the space between, and this is taken from the Samoan definition. Wa, the second definition we have, is the Maori term, which again you can see sounds very similar, but has a slightly definition, although I might suggest also relatively similar. For the rest of this little mini lecture that I'm doing, I will be using the term va, the first one there with a V. It has been more popularly adopted by contemporary artists, including artists in Aotearoa, New Zealand, when talking about this specific notion and idea, although it's important to understand, again, that the spelling and definition does vary, and the application and expression of this idea does manifest differently from place to place as well. So again, keep that in mind. So as per these definitions, va refers to the space in between, but it also has to do with time, duration, cycles of time. And when we're really getting down to the meaning of what this term really means, all of these things need to be taken into account. And so this is why it's referred to as a spatio-temporal concept, because there is an element of the spatial having to do with relations, relationships, exchanges of energy, and the holding of presence. In terms of artworks, it can be the relational space between the artwork itself and the viewer, which is created between and sort of outside the physical medium of the artwork itself. And that also has to do with the curator, how they're positioning a work within a gallery. As well is the space of dialogue created inside of the work, how the artist is creating a space of dialogue between histories, between contexts, places, peoples, themselves and their ancestors in some cases, the subject and the figures they represent. And there's also the element of the temporal, which is to bring the past sort of into the future and through the present, to activate histories into one space visually. And I'll talk more about how this is accomplished. Bernita Webbinder states that we need to think about va not only on a physical and relational level, so again, that first spatial definition, but also metaphorically to describe post-colonial situations where Pacific Island peoples, especially creatives and writers who work within the realm of the imagination, find themselves negotiating spaces between and across different cultural worlds, redefining and repositioning themselves in the process. So again, we can see that this concept of va plays a role, particularly for those producing creative visual material, which sort of visually manifests this notion of va. You can sort of think of artists as the visual conveyors of this notion in a big way, and I think especially contemporary Indigenous Polynesian artists are really taking this up as well. So I don't think I could talk about va without using the Samoan poet and writer Albert Wendt's definition, which is very frequently cited and very widely used as being one of the most true to form, so to speak, definitions of the notion. And he says, va is the space between, the betweenness, not an empty space, not space that separates, but space that relates, that holds separate entities and things together in the unity that is all, the space that is context, giving meaning to things. The meanings change as the relationships and context change. And I wanted to give you those two definitions of va, because I think they both lend to each other in describing what it really is, because again, it's sort of hard to grasp as you're first jumping into being introduced to this idea. So in this way, va can be used to activate artworks within contexts of history, with genealogic presence, and can also serve for a didactic function, a didactic exchange through various means, again, which I will go over shortly. It's very similar to how Caroline Vercoe discusses the concept of place in her article, which is also sort of looking at it as spatial and temporal as well. So I would really suggest keeping these two ideas in mind and sort of using them in tandem with each other when you're analyzing these artworks. Before we really dive into that, I do want to define this term post-colonial. I used it once already, and Albert Wendt's quote that I took is from an article called Tattooing the Post-Colonial Body, and I think it's worth mentioning. Firstly, because the definition that pops up on Google is not what I'm referring to or what the authors are referring to. On Google, if you just type it into the internet, post-colonial comes up with occurring or existing after the end of colonial rule. And I am more referring to the study of the cultural legacy of colonialism and imperialism, focusing on the human consequences of the control and exploitation of colonized people and their lands. And as contemporary artists and authors we've looked at in this course so far, I think they have confirmed for us that the effects and continuations of colonialism are very much still present today. And secondly, I think it's important to understand this term because visualizing va, especially through contemporary art in a contemporary context, is often paired with artists who are grappling with post-colonial realities through identifying histories with iconography, colors, medium, and even their own bodies to remember, reactivate, recreate these events. Such as Lily Laita in her oil painting works, which I will talk about here in a second. It's the one you're looking at right now. So this artist is Maori, Samoan, and Pakeha, or white descent. In her painting, she uses some recognizable visual iconographies of different times and places to sort of bring histories into dialogue with one another, using iconography to signal historical context. This is done through, items, events, as well as relating to her own identity within this dialogue, which is Maori and mainly Samoan. This painting, after Westminster, is a reference in its title to the Fijian coup, the political coup in 2000, and is an expression of both cultural solidarity and the effects of an abuse of power. In her painting, There's a Maori staff, which is on the left side of the painting. It's a taiaha. You can kind of see it going vertically down the center of the flag there on the left. And the Samoan ta'oto, and then there's which is in the blue, as well as the British crown, which is green. You can see it's sort of centered. It's sort of toppled over as well. All of these elements are identifiable, really, if you know what they are, and they're sort of vying for each other for space on this canvas. There's sort of a clash in the energy of the brushstrokes, in the passages of color, which create the sense of struggle but also renewed energy within the canvas. With the statement in letters, "Democracy is a foreign flower," with a P being crossed over the top of the FL of flower, creating power, this canvas sort of acts as a flag to the complicated journey of national sovereignty. The artist also intentionally uses medium to manifest Va. So not only is she calling upon times and places through iconography and creating a narrative through stylistic form, so those brushstrokes, the intense colors, but also particularly as she begins each work, and not just this painting in particular, from black canvas. And she stated that it gets to this idea of bringing energy and bringing life through the darkness, from the darkness, through these layers of paint and color. They might be thicker or thinner, but it creates a sense of depth, and that depth can also be seen as a temporal concept, depth through time and depth through the canvas. So here time and space are related. Time spent for the artist creating those layers, the historical time with which this is mentioned. The coup happened in 2000, and the artist did this in 2001, so it really wasn't that far off from the actual time of the event. But the space on the canvas sort of reimagines and enlivens this event once again through the artist's lens. And I think there's also a cleverness and playfulness to this work. The play on words at the top, which holds multiple meanings, the vibrant, energetic brushstrokes. I want to bring this idea of playfulness up as well, which is also used by other artists to sort of grapple with these issues. The layering of the visible, sort of identifiable iconography, the crown, the flag, the star, even the title, the hands, the orator staff in the foreground, sort of link the artist's identity as Samoan and Maori, and also work to again position this event in the canvas. So in short, there are many layers, literally, physically, and also metaphorically and conceptually. And this is really, I think, when Va is actualized, when it's done holistically, when all parts are taken into account. Again, she uses oil paint, so it's a non-traditional medium for Maori or Samoan folks to work, but she uses it to work within what she feels is in line with this activation of Va in its materiality. And now, I'm going to get into one more work, which Marion will also discuss in her lecture. Greg Simu is another contemporary artist in Aotearoa, New Zealand, of Samoan descent. And again, you'll see his work in Marion's lecture. So this work in particular, I wanted to talk about a little bit more in depth. As Marion mentions, there are obvious and intentional parallels to the Italian Renaissance artist Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, and this is his fresco painting. The Samoan Jesus figure now has tatau and pea around the waist, which is a traditional Samoan tatau, a tattoo, basically, which dates back in practice much longer before the birth of Christ. So there's that play with time. How long is time really in terms of how we think about it? What we might think or those familiar with the Christian religion, what we think to be around for what seems like forever, something like Christianity, really isn't as old as we may think it is. Simu talks about this idea of short-term memory, that we are keen to forget what has happened in the past. And as Marion goes over the top image, Simu's photograph reads distinctly Pacific Islander, while retaining the setup to mimic what has become a truly iconic image in the Western canon by Da Vinci. And there are some ironies that the artist intentionally draws upon in this image. In the Christian faith, bread and wine in Holy Communion is a physical manifestation of the blood and body of Christ, as an embodiment of Christ himself for his followers to consume. So Simu is really pointing out the hypocrisy here of Christianity, as well as Christian followers who colonized the islands, and in some locations where myths were involved, with stories revolving around cannibalism or ritual cannibalism, those things were used to sort of further dehumanize Pacific Islander individuals and excuse them as primitive, all the while these Christian Europeans were taking communion as a metaphorical cannibalistic ritual. And Simu also uses nudity, again a biblical reference in some regard to recall Adam and Eve naked in the Garden of Eden, but also as a historic reference to the eroticization of Pacific Islander nudity during this period of initial colonization. And specifically, he even goes on to reference the paintings of Paul Gauguin and the further sexualization, particularly of Pacific Islander women, mainly from Tahiti and Fiji and Samoa. So, multiple references are coming out of this image to create impact and poignancy. And again, using recognizable and visual iconographies of different times to bring histories into dialogue with one another, sort of signaling these historical contexts, persons even, tropes. I think he's ultimately seeking to subvert these ideas, to reroute them. I wanted to touch on a close-up of his work, and you can see it in this. She is on the right-hand side. So in particular, this woman who is now on the left of this trio at the top, Simu talks specifically about how this woman represents multiple things. Again, Eve in the Garden of Eden, so there's the biblical reference there, as well as Liberty Leading the People from Eugene Delacroix's Romantic painting, and also a Paul Gauguin painting, Two Tahitian Women. So again, we have many layers of iconography going on, many histories being played upon here, but I think there's also a thread he's drawing on women's bodies more broadly, being a subject of the gaze, being objects to be looked at without autonomy, even if they are powerful, seemingly powerful figures like the idea of liberty and freedom. Simu has stated that his goal is to engage the public and connect indigenous communities. And I think this can be said more broadly about using the concept of Va as well. It engages the public, and it can even be didactic, even when that learning comes from a place of discomfort when learning about colonial histories. And I keep saying recognizable iconography because the potential educational and confrontational quality of these works really shines through from their ability to expose the viewer to things that they would recognize. The goal is to sort of get you thinking, to activate you. Many elements are brought into dialogue with one another. He's really bringing them into the present. He's seeking to remember them, to allow us to not forget, to allow communities in the Pacific to heal. He has, as an artist himself, as well as the communities he's representing here in his image. He is seeking to reclaim or reroute these identifiable iconographies that I've been talking about, to hijack the narrative and make it his own, to flip the power structure and flip who gets to tell the story and how. So these works don't only exist within themselves. They're located in spaces, seen by viewers, not always those who are a part of the community that is being represented. VA is created not only within the work, but made in the space between the viewer and the piece. It's engaging and allowing for self-interrogation and learning to occur. It opens that space up for the viewer. As I started off this lecture by saying, I've only discussed really 2 examples of how VA is manifested in artworks by 2 different artists, I think in different ways, using different mediums to convey their message and to activate the space that they're in and the space of wherever the artwork will lie. So as you continue into this week, begin to think about how this notion is used by contemporary artists and why it's important to remember, reactivate, and retell these histories and traditions. And I'll just sign off by saying again that VA is the space that is context, giving meaning to things. Thanks, everyone. For those of you in my section, I will be seeing you soon. And to everyone else, thank you so much for listening.